I need you to stop everything you're doing right now and pay attention. This is Charlie Munger's favorite book, and I just finished it. Now, this book doesn't just add information to your brain, it restructures the way your brain processes information. Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. He's the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. And I'm going to make the case to you today that this is the single most important book about competitive strategy ever written. Even though the author is a biologist who studies birds in Papua New Guinea and didn't write a single word of it with business in mind, I read it cover to cover twice, took over 60 pages of notes, and cross referenced it against everything I've learned with studying the greatest leaders of our generation and the past. And I'm now convinced the patterns Diamond identifies across 13,000 years of civilizations are identical to the patterns that make certain companies dominate their markets. The reason Silicon Valley is in California and not Papua New Guinea. The reason English is the language of global business and not Quechua. It all traces back to geographic bets nobody intentionally placed and compounding advantages that took thousands of years to play out. Today you're going to learn why 99% entrepreneurs are obsessed with the wrong layer of the problem. You're going to hear the most terrifying business story I've ever encountered. 168 men defeating an army of 80,000 in a single afternoon. And you're going to walk away with the framework I'm calling Diamond's 4 factors that maps directly onto how companies win and lose today. The one core idea of this entire book is this: environment is strategy. Geography is destiny. The founders who internalize this build empires. The ones who ignore it build sandcastles. Now let's get into it. I'm drinking my tea. Now, first, there's a line near the end of the book, and I circled it multiple times and wrote in all caps in my notebook. It's on the final page of the epilogue. And I think it explains the entire thesis of this 480-page masterwork. Diamond writes, the striking differences between the long-term histories of peoples of the different continents have been due not to innate differences in the peoples themselves, but to differences in their environments. Read that again slowly. Listen to that again. Burn it into your brain. The differences were not due to innate differences in the peoples themselves. They were due to differences in their environments. This is the most important sentence in this book, and I'm going to repeat it throughout this episode because it applies to so much more than anthropology. It applies to startups. It applies to markets. It applies to career. It applies to investing. It applies to everything. And when I read the sentence, I immediately thought about something Charlie Munger once said. Munger argued that if you put a great manager in a bad business, its reputation of the business that remains intact, the business wins. The environment wins. The terrain eats the talent. And Diamond is saying the exact same thing, just at civilizational scale instead of corporate scale. The people in the losing civilizations were not dumber. They were not lazier. They were not genetically inferior. Jared makes this case with extraordinary force. In fact, he argues persuasively that New Guineans are probably more intelligent on average than Europeans because their survival environment was so demanding that natural selection ruthlessly called anyone who wasn't cognitively exceptional. European survival, by contrast, was determined by resistance to infectious disease than by intelligence, which meant that evolutionary selection pressure operated on body chemistry rather than on brain power. So the winners, so-called winners of history, were, if anything, less intellectually gifted than the losers. They just had the wrong geography, the wrong starting hand, the wrong axis of distribution, and I will talk more of that later. And those structural disadvantages compounded over millennia until the gap became unclosable. Now, think about how many times you've seen the same thing in business. A brilliant founder with a terrible market. A mediocre founder with a perfect tailwind. The environment ate them alive or carried them to glory. Same human, different terrain, same intelligence, different continent. I see this constantly when I study founder biographies. The most brilliant person I've ever read about, one of them is Elon Musk, Nikola Tesla. So let's go over Nikola Tesla. A mind so extraordinary that he could visualize entire machines in 3 dimensions inside his head, test them mentally, identify flaws before a single component was built. But Tesla died broke in a hotel room feeding pigeons. Meanwhile, less brilliant contemporaries who positioned themselves in better environments, who planted their seeds in richer soil, but fortunes that lasted generations. The talent was equal, the terrain was not, and the terrain won. Diamond spent 25 years researching this book because of a single question. He was walking along a beach in New Guinea in 1972, and a local politician named Yali asked him a devastatingly simple question. And that question is, why is it that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own? That's it. That's the question. And Jared spent a quarter century trying to answer it honestly, without resorting to racist explanations, without copping out with some vague cultural differences, hand wave, without falling back on the intellectually lazy answers that had persisted for centuries. His conclusion? It wasn't the people. It was the platform they were standing on. It was the raw materials they had access to. It was the direction their continent pointed. It was the animals they could domesticate, the crops they could cultivate, the disease they could survive, and the speed at which innovations could spread across their landmass. Environment is the strategy. And I'm going to show you why. So, the first lesson of the book, Principle 1, is the proximate versus ultimate trap. Here's how most people explain why Europe conquered the world. Guns, superior technology, better ships, nasty germs, steel weapons, done, cased, closed. And then there's Diamond's response. Sure, that's accurate, but it's only the proximate explanation. The surface level, immediate cause. The real question, the one that actually matters, is why did Europeans have guns, germs, and steel in the first place? Why didn't Native Americans have those things? Why didn't Aboriginal Australians develop writing on metallurgy or ocean-going ships? This dysfunction between proximate and ultimate causes is one of the most useful mental models I've ever encountered. And I see entrepreneurs get it wrong constantly. Here's the business version. Someone asks, why is company X winning? And the proximate answer is always obvious. They have better marketing. They have more funding. They have stronger sales team. Fine. But that's not the real answer. The real answer is, why do they have better marketing? Because they had better unit economics, which gave them more cash to spend. And why did they have better unit economics? Because their product was built on a platform with native distribution. And why was their product on that platform? Because the founders understood the structural advantage of being early to a specific ecosystem. That's the chain of causation, the ultimate thinking. And Diamond applies it across 13,000 years of human history with surgical precision. The proximate cause of European dominance was technology. The ultimate cause was food production. The ultimate cause of food production was the geographic distribution of domesticable plants and animals. The ultimate cause of that was the shape of the continent itself. This is the same logic Jeff Bezos uses when he says, focus on what's not going to change. Bezos is thinking at the ultimate level. Most of his competitors were thinking at the proximate level, which shipping carrier to use, which ad platform to invest in, while Bezos was obsessing over structural unchanging advantages, which is low prices, fast delivery, vast selection. Those are the geographic features of the retail landscape. Everything else is noise. Understand, same pattern, different domain, and same principle. Now, principle number 2, lesson number 2, the Cajamarca principle. Now, here's the part of the book that knocked me sideways. I've read about battles. I've read about Alexander the Great. I've read about Napoleon's campaigns and Patton's tank warfare and every military biography I could get my hands on. But nothing compares to what happened at Cajamarca on November 16th, 1532. Okay? So here's the facts. Francisco Pizarro had 168 soldiers. That's it. 168 men. 62 on horseback, 106 on foot. They were 1,000 miles from the nearest Spanish outpost in Panama. No reinforcements coming. No supply lines. They were exhausted, terrified, and completely surrounded. On the other side, Atahualpa, the emperor of the Inca Empire, the largest and most advanced civilization in the New World, commanding an army of 80,000 soldiers who had just won a civil war in the heart of his own territory, surrounded by millions of subjects who worship him as a living god. 168 versus 80,000. And by sundown, Pizarro had captured Atahualpa. 7,000 Inca soldiers were dead. Not a single Spaniard died. How the hell does this happen? Read the eyewitness accounts, and Jared quotes them extensively. The Spanish soldiers were so terrified that many of them urinated on themselves before the battle began. They could see the Inca campfire stretching across the valley for 15 or 20 miles. One of Pizarro's officers estimated the enemy at 40,000, and he was lowballing it by half because he didn't want to panic his own men further. And yet when the trapping was sprung, when the artillery fired and the horses charged and the steel swords started cutting through the crowd, it was a massacre. The Inca soldiers were wearing quilted armor and carrying wooden clubs. The Spaniards had steel helmets, steel swords, chainmail, and mounted cavalry. The Incas had never seen a horse before. They've never heard a cannon blast. The technological and psychological gulf was so vast that 80,000 men couldn't overcome it. Here's the insight that changes everything. This wasn't about courage. The Inca soldiers were brave. They kept holding up Atahualpa's litter even as their brothers were slaughtered around them. And as each man fell, another immediately took his place until finally the Spaniards pushed the litter over. The Incas had courage in abundance. What they lacked was the platform. The Spaniards' advantage wasn't bravery or genius. It was a compounding effect of 10,000 years of environmental advantage. They had steel because their ancestors had metallurgy. They had metallurgy because their ancestors had food surpluses. They had food surpluses because their ancestors lived in the Fertile Crescent, a region with an absurd concentration of domesticable plants and animals. They had horses because horses were native to Eurasia and were domesticated thousands of years earlier. They had writing because writing emerged independently in their cultural lineage. They had guns because gunpowder migrated from China along east-west axis of Eurasia, a continent where innovations could spread rapidly because the landmass runs primarily east to west, meaning crops, animals, and technologies move across thousands of miles of similar climate. Every single advantage the Spaniards had at Cajamarca was the result of a compounding chain stretching back millennia. Not one of those advantages originated with Pizarro himself. He was standing on a mountain of accumulated civilizational capital that the Incas simply never had the opportunity to build. This is the same dynamic when a startup backed by Y Combinator with access to Silicon Valley's networks, AWS infrastructure, and open source tooling goes up against a team in a market with zero venture capital ecosystem. No cloud infrastructure, no talent pool. The individual founders might be equally brilliant, but the platform differential is devastating. This reminds me exactly of what I learned reading about Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie didn't invent steel. He didn't even understand metallurgy particularly well at first. What Carnegie understood was positioning. He placed himself at the intersection of railroads, coal, iron ore, and immigrant labor in Pittsburgh. He built on top of a compounding infrastructure that already existed. The platform made the man, same pattern. Cajamarca, Carnegie, the compounding platform always wins. Lesson number 3, the food production cascade. Now, the central argument of this book, the spine that connects everything, is Jared's thesis about food production. And I want you to understand it clearly because it maps perfectly onto how compound advantages work in business. Here's the cascade. It goes like this. Geography gives you domesticable plants and animals. Domesticable plants and animals give you food production. Food production gives you food surpluses. Food surpluses give you population density. Population density gives you specialists, which is people who don't farm. Specialists give you inventors, soldiers, bureaucrats, and priests. Inventors give you technology. Soldiers give you military power. Bureaucrats give you organized government. Priests give you ideology and social cohesion. Technology, military power, government, and ideology give you empire. That's the cascade. And it all starts with one thing. What grew in your dirt? And what walked on your land? Now watch what happens next. This is where the compounding really accelerates. Food production didn't just give you more people. It gave you qualitatively different people. In a hunter-gatherer society, everyone has the same job, finding food. There are no specialists. There are no division of labor. The entire band spends its cognitive capacity on survival. But the moment you have farmers producing more food than they can eat, you free up human beings to the other things. And those other things, what do we call them? Civilization. The first full-time specialists in human history weren't engineers or artists. They were chiefs and priests, political and religious elites who live off the food surpluses produced by farmers. And those elites, free from the daily grind of food procurement, could spend their time doing something no hunter-gatherer had the luxury to do. Thinking at scale, planning organizing, building institutions that outlasted individual human lifespans. This is exactly what happens in startups when they achieve product market fit and the revenue starts compounding. Before product market fit, everyone on the team is scrambling to survive, doing customer support, writing code, running ads, making sales calls. There are no specialists because there's no surplus. But the moment revenue exceeds cost and you achieve positive unit economics, that's your food production moment. Suddenly you can hire specialists, a dedicated head of sales, a VP of engineering, a CFO. And those specialists, freed from the general scramble, can think at scale. They can build systems. They can create institutional knowledge. The organizational cascade begins. The Fertile Crescent, the modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and surrounding regions, had an outrageous head start. Jared documents it with devastating precision. Out of the world's 56 large-seeded wildgrass species, 32 of them were concentrated in the Mediterranean zone, with the Fertile Crescent having the densest cluster. The region also had 4 of 5 most important domesticated livestock species: sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, all native to that area. Think about what that means in business terms. Imagine one startup launches in a market with 32 potential revenue streams and 4 major distributional channels already in place. And another startup launches in a market with 2 potential revenue streams and 0 established distribution channels. Who wins? It's not even a competition. The starting materials determine the trajectory. Meanwhile, Australia, 0 domesticable large animals. The Americas, after Pleistocene extinctions wiped out most large mammals around 13,000 years ago, the only domesticable large animal left in the entire Western Hemisphere was the llama, and it was limited to a small region in the Andes. No horses, no cows, no pigs, no sheep, no goats. The biological inventory was essentially empty. So you had the Eurasia sitting on a gold mine of biological starting materials, while other continents were trying to build civilizations with almost nothing in the vault. That's not a failure of intelligence. That's a failure of inventory. That's the compounding was relentless. Eurasia early food production gave it a multi-thousand-year head start over every other continent. By the time America's independently developed food production, Eurasia had already accumulated 5,000 years of compounding advantages. 5,000 years of growing populations, developing specialists, inventing technologies, and building institutions. That gap never closed. It only widened. And this is what Warren Buffett means when he talks about compounding. He's not just talking about money. He's talking about the exponential nature of accumulated advantages. A 1% edge compounded over enough time becomes an insurmountable moat. The Fertile Crescent didn't have a 1% edge. It had a massive head starting materials and a 5,000-year time advantage over its closest competitors. The result civilizational moat was essentially unbreachable. And if you're a Charlie Munger fan, he always talks about the power of compounding. And this is where it gets personal for founders and for people like you listening to this podcast. The quality of your raw materials, your market, your technology stack, your initial customer base, your founding team, your actions compound also. Now, this determines your ceiling more than almost anything you do after launch. I think about Paul Graham's famous essay about startup ideas. He argues that the best founders don't look for ideas. They look for problems in fertile territory. They plant seeds where the soil is the richest. That's food production thinking. You know who understood this intuitively? Sam Walton. And if you haven't read his book, I highly suggest you read his book, Made in America. And what struck me is that he didn't compete on brilliance. He competed on geography. He put his stores in small towns that the big chains ignored. Nobody else wanted that dirt, but Sam recognized that rural America was the fertile crescent of discount retail, underserved populations, low real estate cost, and a captive customer base with no alternatives. He optimized for the environment first, and then his operational obsession compounded on top of that structural advantage. Food production thinking. Plant where the soil is richest. Now, lesson number 4, the access advantage. Now, here's the idea in this book that I think is the most brilliant, the most overlooked, and the most directly applicable to building companies. It's Jared's argument about continental access, and it blew my mind. Eurasia runs east to west. The Americas run north to south. Africa runs north to south. Why does this matter? Because crops, animals, and technologies spread most easily along lines of similar latitude. Because latitude determines climate, day length, rainfall, and growing seasons. A crop domesticated in the Fertile Crescent could easily spread thousands of miles to India and west to Europe without major modification, because all those regions were roughly the same latitude and therefore roughly the same growing conditions. But a crop domesticated in Mexico to reach Peru, it had to travel through the isthmus of Central America, a narrow tropical bottleneck with completely different growing conditions. To reach the Mississippi Valley, it had to cross deserts and mountain ranges and shift between climate zones. This is why corn domesticated in Mexico around 3500 BC didn't reach the eastern United States for centuries, and even then, it required significant genetic adaptation to survive in the new environment. Same thing in Africa. Egypt's wheat and barley, Mediterranean crops that require winter rains, could not cross the Sahara and the equatorial band to reach southern Africa. They literally couldn't travel the length of their own continent. The Khoisan people at the southern tip of Africa never developed agriculture, not because they lacked intelligence, but because the crops that could have transformed their society were trapped thousands of miles to the north behind impassable climatic barriers. The Fertile Crescent crops spread 10,000 miles east to west across Eurasia in a few thousand years. Egypt's crops couldn't travel 4,000 miles south on their own continent in 8,000 years. That's the access effect, and it changed everything. Now apply this technology companies, okay? What is the access of your own distribution? When you build a product, can your innovation spread easily to adjacent markets? Or do they hit bottleneck after bottleneck? And this is exactly what Amazon Web Services is so dominant. AWS didn't just build cloud infrastructure. It built along an east-west axis. A tool designed for a startup in San Francisco worked identically for a startup in Berlin, which worked identically for a startup in Singapore, same latitude, metaphorically speaking, same climate, same growing conditions. The product spread horizontally across thousands of use cases without significant modification. Compare that to an enterprise software companies that built vertically. One bespoke solutions for healthcare, another for finance, another for manufacturing, north-south axis. Every step required readaptation. Every expansion was a battle against new climate zone. The horizontal platforms ate them alive. And for the same exact reason, Eurasia east-west axis crushed the Americas north-south axis. Think about what Patrick Collison and the Stripe team did. Stripe built along the east-west axis of internet commerce. Their payment infrastructure worked for a solo developer building side project and for a multinational corporation processing millions of transactions. Same latitude, same climate, the innovation spread effortlessly. Every competitor who tried to build vertically, custom solutions for specific industries, was fighting the access problem. And Stripe, like Eurasia, won because direction of spread was on their side. Principle number 5, the Anna Karenina principle. Now, it gets even more interesting. Diamond opens up one of his most important chapters, which one of the greatest opening lines in all of nonfiction. He adapts the first sentence to Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. Domesticable animals are all alike. Every undomesticable animal is undomesticable in its own way. So Tolstoy's original happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. The idea is simple but profound. For a marriage to be happy, it must succeed along many different dimensions simultaneously: sexual attraction, financial agreement, parenting philosophy, shared values, compatibility with in-laws. Failure in any of those dimensions can doom the entire enterprise. Diamond applies this to animal domestication, and the insights is killer. Out of the world's 148 large wild herbivorous mammals, only 14 were successfully domesticated. Only 14 out of 148. And of those 14, the vast majority were Eurasian. Why? Because domestication requires success across 6 independent dimensions simultaneously. The animal must have the right diet, not too expensive to feed. It must grow fast enough to be economically worthwhile. It must be willing to breed in captivity. It must have a manageable disposition. You can't domesticate an animal that kills zookeepers. It must be resistant to panic. Animals that bolt when startled, like gazelles, are useless. And it must have a suitable social hierarchy. Animals with a dominant structure can imprint on a human master. Fail on any of these and domestication is impossible. Zebras, perfect candidates on paper, similar to horses, native to Africa, abundant. But zebras have a vicious temperament. They bite and they don't let go. They're nearly impossible to lasso, and they lack the social hierarchy that allows horses to accept a human as their herd leader. Countless attempts to domesticate zebras have failed throughout history. Every single time. They failed for different reasons. Now, hippos grow fast, abundant meat, native to Africa, but they kill more people annually than any other large African mammal. You can't domesticate an animal that views you as an obstacle to be removed. Grizzly bears grow fast, eat anything, massive amounts of meat, but they take too long to reach maturity. They're solitary and resist social hierarchies, and they will kill you. So here's why this matters for founders. The Anna Karenina principle is the most accurate description I've ever read of why most startups fail. Success requires getting dozens of variables right simultaneously: product market fit, team composition, timing, capitalization, unit economics, distribution, retention, company culture, regulatory environment. Failure in any single dimension can destroy the entire enterprise. And just like with animal domestication, there are far more ways to fail than there are ways to succeed. The 14 that made it out of 148, that's 9.5% success rate. Sound similar? That's roughly the survival rate of venture-backed startups. The math of domestication and the math of startup survival are eerily similar, and for exactly the same reason. Success requires simultaneously optimization across multiple independent dimensions. This is why I'm always telling you, the more I read, the more patterns I see. Charlie Munger talks about this all the time. He calls them the Lollapalooza effects. When multiple factors combine simultaneously in the same direction, that's what domestication is. That's what a successful startup is. That's what Tolstoy was describing in Families. You need the Lollapalooza. You need every variable to line up. Otherwise, you get a zebra instead of a horse. Now, Jared's 4 factors of civilizational dominance, and I'm about to share you his algorithm, the algorithm for that, all right? In the epilogue, Diamond distills 13,000 years of research into what I'm calling the 4 factors. This is the algorithm. You have to pay attention to this. Now, this is the cheat sheet for civilizational dominance, and I've mapped each factor directly onto businesses. I want you to tattoo these on your wall, your desk, and evaluate every major decision against them. All right, so the first factor, starting materials. The wild plants and animals available for domestication. Eurasia had 33 of the world's 56 large-seeded wild grasses and the vast majority of domesticable large animals. The Americas and Australia had almost none after the Pleistocene extinctions. What does that mean? Well, in business context, your market's raw materials, talent pool and available technology, the existing infrastructure, the regulatory environment, Mark Andreessen calls this the market. And he argues that the market matters more than the team or product. Jared agrees, and his data set covers 13,000 years instead of 30. When I think about the founders who built truly iconic companies, Bezos, Jobs, Gates, Page, Brin, Musk, every single one of them chose a market with extraordinary raw materials. The internet in the mid-1990s was the fertile crescent of our generation, rich with domesticable technologies, ripe for cultivation, and largely unoccupied. Factor 2, rate of diffusion. How fast innovation spread with your geography. Eurasia's east axis allowed rapid diffusion. The Americas and Africa's north-south axis created bottlenecks. Business translation. Your distribution speed. How quickly can your product reach adjacent markets? How much friction exists between you and the next million users? Companies with horizontal distributions, platforms, APIs, self-serve products spread like crops along an east-west axis. Companies requiring vertical bespoke expansion, enterprise sales, geographic rollouts, regulatory approvals are fighting a north-south axis problems. Slack spread horizontally inside organization at a rate that no enterprise sales team could match. Zoom spread horizontally during the pandemic because the product worked identically for a 10-person startup and a 10,000-person corporation. Horizontal diffusion, east axis, east-west axis. The innovation move without friction. Factor number 3, intercontinental diffusion. So some continents could receive innovations from neighbors. Sub-Saharan Africa received livestock from the Fertile Crescent. The Americas receive almost nothing from Eurasia because of ocean barriers. How does that apply in business, and what is the business translation of that? Ecosystem connectivity. Can you plug into existing platforms and networks? Companies building on iOS, Android, AWS, and Shopify get to absorb the innovations of those ecosystems for free. Companies building in isolation in disconnected geographies or proprietary walled gardens are like the Americas, cut off from the global flow of innovation. I think about it every time I see a startup building on a proprietary tech stack that doesn't integrate with anything. You're building on a continent with no land bridges. Every innovation has to be developed from scratch. Meanwhile, your competitor is plugging into a rich ecosystem of APIs, open source tools, and shared infrastructure and absorbing decades of accumulated innovation overnight. That's intercontinental diffusion. That's the land bridge between your continent and the accumulated knowledge of the entire Eurasian landmass. Factor 4, total area and population. More people means more potential inventors, more competing societies, more pressure to innovate, and more pressure to adopt innovations or face elimination. Eurasia had the largest area and population. Australia and New Guinea had the smallest. How does that translate in business? Well, the total addressable market and competitive density. This is why the best companies build a massive markets with intense competition, not in small niches. The competitive pressure forces innovation. The market size rewards scale. Jeff Bezos chose to build in the largest addressable market on earth, all of retail, because he understood that in a large arena, the compounding effects are exponentially more powerful. A larger market also means more competitors, which means more innovation, which means the winners who survive the competitive crucible emerge with the battle-tested products that dominate globally. Small markets breed complacency. Large markets breed champions. Those are the 4 factors: starting materials, rate of diffusion, ecosystem connectivity, market size, and competitive density. Write them down. Put them on your wall. Every strategic decision you should make should be evaluated against your 4 variables. Before you write a single line of code, before you hire a single employee, before you raise a single dollar, ask yourself, what are my starting materials? What's my axis of distribution? Am I connected to the global ecosystem of innovation? And is my market large enough and competitive enough to force me to become great? If the answer to any of those questions is unsatisfactory, fix the terrain before you start marching, because no amount of tactical brilliance can overcome bad geography. Lesson number 6, okay? Lesson number 6. If you found this valuable, I want you to subscribe if you haven't already and hit the bell button. Principle number 6 is called the writing advantage, the information technology as civilizational leverage. Now, there's a chapter in the book about the evolution of writing that I think is criminally underappreciated. Most people skim past it. That's a mistake, because Jared makes an argument about writing that applies directly to every information technology revolution we've ever witnessed. Writing was independently invented only a handful of times in all of human history, maybe 3 times. Sumerian in the Fertile Crescent around 3000 BC, Chinese writing by 1300 BC at the latest, and Mesoamerican writing system by at least 600 BC. Every other writing system on the planet was either borrowed, adapted, or inspired by one of those original inventions. Now, here's the critical insight. Writing didn't emerge from some random burst of creativity. It emerged as a necessary consequence of food production and political complexity. When you have food surpluses, you need to track them. When you have taxes, you need to record them. When you have trade across thousands of miles, you need contracts. When you have armies, you need orders that survive the journey from the general to the front lines. Writing wasn't invented by poets. It was invented by accountants and bureaucrats. The earliest signed Sumerian writing, inventory list, grain quantities, tax records, not literature, not philosophy, bookkeeping. The most transformative information technology in human history was born from the need to manage inventory at scale. This reminds me so much of what happened in Silicon Valley. The internet wasn't invented for social media or content creation. It was invented by the Defense Department to maintain communication networks during nuclear war. Email wasn't designed for marketing campaigns. It was designed for government researchers to share memos. Google wasn't built to sell advertising. It was built to organize academic research papers. Every single time, the revolutionary information technology was born from boring. practical and operational necessity, and then it exploded into something unimaginably larger. And here's the compounding effect that Jared identifies. Societies with writing could accumulate knowledge across generations. They could record past failures and successes. They could transmit innovations with far greater precision than oral traditions allowed. And this is why it's very important to read books. Okay, now back. A society with writing was running a fundamentally different operating system than a society without it. It wasn't a small advantage. It was a categorical difference. Think about it. Before writing, every piece of knowledge had to survive in someone's memory. When the person died, the knowledge died with them, unless they managed to transmit it orally to the next generation, losing fidelity with every retelling, just like that telephone game. And after writing, knowledge became permanent. It became searchable. It became transferable across time and space. The Incas, despite building one of the most impressive civilizations in the Western Hemisphere, never developed writing. They had a sophisticated record system called quipu, noted strings that could encode numerical information, but nothing that could preserve complex narratives, military strategy, or technological instructions with full fidelity. When Pizarro arrived with the documents describing previous Spanish conquests, detailed accounts of strategies that had worked, mistakes to avoid, terrain assessments, the information asymmetry was staggering. Pizarro knew about the Inca Empire before he arrived. He'd read accounts from other explorers. The Incas knew absolutely nothing about Spain, about Europe, about steel, about horses, about anything beyond their own hemisphere. That's the writing advantage. The information technology as civilizational leverage. And the business lesson is obvious. The companies that invest most aggressively in institutional knowledge, in documentation, in data infrastructure, in systems that can compound learning over time, have an almost unfair advantage over competitors that rely on tribal knowledge trapped in individual people's heads. Amazon's famous 6-page memos, Stripe's internal documentation culture, Ray Dalio's principle codified into algorithms at Bridgewater. These aren't corporate quirks. These are writing systems. These are Sumerian for the modern enterprise. They turn ephemeral knowledge into permanent infrastructure. And the companies that don't invest in this, they're the Incas. Smart people, brave people, capable of extraordinary achievements, but running without the fundamental technology that would let their knowledge compound across time. Lesson number 7, Necessity's Mother. There's another chapter that Diamond titles Necessity's Mother, a deliberate inversion of the cliche, necessity is the mother of invention. And the argument is counterintuitive, provocative, and once you absorb it, completely obvious. The conventional wisdom says people identify a need when they invent a technology to fill that need. Necessity drives invention. Jared demolishes this. His argument, supported by example after example, is exactly the opposite. Most major inventions were made by people who were tinkering out of curiosity, and the application was discovered after the fact. Thomas Edison, phonograph, was originally designed to record telephone messages and preserve the dying words of the terminally ill. Music, entertainment, nobody saw that coming. Least of all, Edison himself. The automobile was initially seen as an expensive, unreliable toy for the rich, not a replacement for the horse. James Watt's steam engine was developed to pump out water out of coal mines, not to power factories or locomotives. Jared argues that the heroic inventor narrative, the lone genius who sees a need and fills it, is almost entirely mythological. In reality, technology evolves incrementally through accumulation, modification, and recombination. And the critical factor isn't inventive genius. It's whether a society has a condition that allowed tinkering, accumulation, and diffusion to happen. Large, dense connected populations with food surpluses produce most tinkerers. More tinkerers produce more accidental discoveries. More accidental discoveries, when shared across a connected network of communities, produce more recombinations and refinements. And the compound effect of that continuous cycle of tinkering, sharing, and refining is what we call technological progress. This is the exact argument that Brian Arthur makes in The Nature of Technology. And it's the same insight that drives Silicon Valley's build fast and iterate culture. Innovation doesn't come from a grand plan. It comes from volume. It comes from creating the conditions in which hundreds or thousands of teams are independently experimenting and letting the best experiments propagate. All right. Let me drink some water. Principle 8, germs as the ultimate weapon. Now here's the part of the book that is genuinely horrifying and brilliantly destructive. Diamond's chapter on germs is one of the most devastating things I've ever read. The central argument, the major killer disease that Europeans carried to the New World, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, plague, all evolved from the disease of domesticated animals, living in close proximity to livestock for thousands of years, created biological crucible in which animal diseases mutated, jumped to humans, killed millions of Europeans over centuries, and left the survivors with generic immunity. When those survivors arrived in Americas, they brought these germs with them, and the result was apocalyptic. An estimated 95% of the Native American population was killed by European diseases, often before they even encountered European soldier. Epidemics raced ahead of the conquistadors themselves. When Pizarro arrived in the Inca Empire, Atahualpa had just won a civil war against his brother, Huascar, a civil war that itself triggered by the death of the previous emperor from smallpox, a disease that had traveled from Panama overland through Inca Empire before any Spaniards. The germs were doing the conquering, and the soldiers were just cleaning up. And here's the part that blew my mind. The exchange was radically one-sided. Europeans transmitted devastating disease to the Americas. The Americas transmitted almost nothing back. Why? Because Americas had almost no domesticated animals. No cows, no pigs, no sheep, no horses, no biological crucible, no millennia-long co-evolution with animal diseases. The entire immunological arms race that Europeans had been running for 10,000 years simply didn't exist in the New World. The insight is brutal. This wasn't biological warfare in the intentional sense, though there were cases that it became exactly that. It became infamous blankets contaminated with smallpox. But in the broader historical sense, it was a structural advantage so profound that it functioned as a weapon mass destruction without anyone designing it. Now, the business parallel here is that what I call biological lock-in, or modern terms, ecosystems lock-in. When you build a platform that customers co-evolve with a long period of time, you create an immunological barrier to competition. Switching cost becomes biological. The integration becomes so deep that ripping it out of the DNA, ripping it out of you would be like ripping out of the DNA. And Jerry didn't use the word lock-in, but that's exactly what he's describing. Germs were Eurasia's biological lock-in against the rest of the world, and the rest of the world had no equivalent. All right, lesson number 9, the fertile trap crescent. Now here's a twist. Here's the part of the book that should scare every market leader. The Fertile Crescent, the region that had the most absorbed head start human history, the birthplace of agriculture, writing, metallurgy, organizing government, is today one of the least productive agricultural regions on Earth. Last part of it are desert, semi-desert, or heavily eroded terrain. The expressions Fertile Crescent and world leader in the food production are, in Diamond's words, absorbed today. What happened? Ecological suicide. The very success of the Fertile Crescent civilization destroyed the environment foundation those civilizations were built on. They cleared forests for agriculture. They cut timber on construction. They burned down wood for fuel and plaster manufacturing. They overgrazed with their abundant goats and sheep. And because the region had low rainfall, the vegetation couldn't grow fast enough. The erosion stripped topsoil. Irrigation caused salt accumulation. The soil that had fed the world's first empires turned to dust. The power shifted westward, from Babylon to Persia, to Greece, to Rome, to Western Europe. As each Eastern Mediterranean society in turn undermines its own resource base, Northern or Western Europe, which had received all its agriculture, technology, and writing from the Fertile Crescent, survived because its higher rainfall made its environment more resilient. Europe wasn't smarter. Europe was luckier. It had more forgiving soil. The business parallel is devastating, and I've seen it play out over and over again. This is Kodak. This is Nokia. This is Blockbuster. This is Xerox. There are Fertile Crescents, first movers who created entire industry, and then destroyed by the very foundation of their dominance through over exploitation and failure to regenerate. And this is why Jeff Bezos reinvests every dollar back into the business. This is why Amazon's margins are deliberately thin, because Bezos understood the Fertile Crescent trap. Instinctively, if you exploit your advantages too aggressively, you salt your own soil. Instead, he reinvested. He regenerated the ecosystem, and Amazon's competitive position has only gotten stronger over time, while the fertile soils like Sears, Kmart, Toys R Us turn to desert. Lesson number 10. The China question. So, Jared raises a fascinating question at the end of the book that I think is one of the most strategic puzzles in all history. Why did Europe, a latecomer that contributed nothing of all significance to old world technology or civilization until after 500 BC, eventually surpassed both the Fertile Crescent and China? China had a massive head start. It developed food production. Nearly as early as the Fertile Crescent, it invented paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass, iron casting, canal locks, and dozens of other technology centuries before Europe. Historians at any point between 8500 BC and 1400 AD would have predicted China as the most likely candidate for global dominance. Europe's eventual rise would have seemed absurd. Dude, okay, think about this. From 1000 AD to 1450 AD, the flow of science and technology was predominantly into Europe from the Islamic world and from China. Not the other way around. Europe was the recipient, not the originator. Europe west of the Alps contributed nothing of significance to technology or civilization before proliferation of water mills around 900 AD. Nothing. For thousands of years, Europe was the backwater. It was the New Guinea of Eurasia. So what happened? How did the backwater become the empire? Jared's explanation is geographic and it's brilliant. China became unified early, politically and culturally. Its relatively smooth of coastline, its navigable rivers running east to west, its two enormous and connectable breadbaskets in the Yellow Gaze and Yangtze River valleys, and its lack of major internal barriers allowed political centralization. A series of powerful dynasties unified China into a single political entity centuries before anything comparable emerging in Europe. And for a long time, that was an advantage. Centralized coordination is incredibly efficient. Centralized taxation funds massive projects. Centralized administration spreads innovation quickly and uniformly. But centralization has a fatal flaw. It creates single points of failure, one bad decisions on top of ripples through the entire system with no error correction, no alternative path, no plan B. When a unified Chinese emperor decided to halt ocean exploration into 1430s, dismantling the world's most advanced naval fleet, which had ships that dwarf anything Europe could build. That was it. One decision, one person, one moment of political caprice and of Chinese maritime dominance. forever. The treasure fleet was destroyed. The dockyards were dismantled. Foreign trade was restricted, and because China was unified under a single authority, there was nobody to disagree, and nobody to fund an alternative expedition, nobody to pick up where the fleet left off. The emperor spoke, the fleet burned, and history changed. Europe, by contrast, was politically fragmented, hopelessly, chaotically, beautifully fragmented. Its coastline was deeply indented. The Iberian Peninsula, the Italian Peninsula, Scandinavia, British Isles, Greece. Internal seas, the Mediterranean, the Baltic, the North Sea, mountain ranges, the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Carpathians, rivers that created natural border between competing states. This geography made political unification nearly impossible. Charlemagne tried, Napoleon tried, Hitler tried, they all failed. Europe remained divided into dozens of competing kingdoms, principalities, and the city-states. And that fragmentation, which often bloodied the chaotic, was strategically brilliant from an innovation standpoint. When Columbus proposed sailing west to reach Asia, the Portuguese turned him down. Then the Duke of Anjou turned him down. Then the Duke of Medina sadly turned him down. The King John of Portugal turned him down. The Spain Isabella and Ferdinand turned him down. And then, after years of rejection, they changed their minds and funded him. In a unified Europe, and one of those rejections would have killed the age of exploration. In a fragmented Europe, Columbus just kept shopping in his idea until one of the dozens of competing power centers said yes. The political fragmentation functioned as a distributed decision-making system, a venture capital ecosystem with hundreds of independent general partners, each making their own bets. This is the exact same principles that make Silicon Valley venture capital systems so powerful. This isn't one decision maker. There are hundreds of competing VCs, each independently evaluating ideas. Hundreds of rejections don't just kill an idea because there are 100 more potential backers. The fragmentation is the feature. The competition is the innovation engine. The chaos is the strategy. Now, compare that to the market dominated by a single government, funding body, or a single dominant corporation. When the entity controls all capital allocation, one bad decision, one emperor, deciding to burn the fleet, can destroy an entire ecosystem of innovation. This is what happened to Soviet space program after the fall of the USSR. This is what happened to the Japanese electronics after the ministries of industry lost their edge. This is what happens in every market where centralization eliminates the competitive pressure that forces innovation. And this is why Peter Thiel's thesis about monopoly needs a caveat. Yes, monopoly profits funds research and development, but monopoly centralization creates single point of failure. The optimal structure isn't monopoly or perfect competition. It's what Europe had and China lacked: intense competition among numerous well-resourced players, none of whom could impose their own will on all the others. Apple, Google, Microsoft, Meta, all intensely competitive with each other. None to dictate terms or the entire system. That fragmentation, that rivalry, is what drives relentlessly innovation. If one of them makes one bad bet, the other exploits it. If one ignores the technology, another picks it up. No emperor can burn. All right, so let me tell you what I wrote in my notebook while I finished reading this. I wrote, the game is won before the game begins. I'm going to say that again because it's very important. The game is won before the game begins. That's the lesson. That's what Jared spent 25 years proving across 13,000 years of data, every continent on Earth. The outcomes were determined, not entirely, but overwhelmingly, by initial conditions, by starting materials, by access of distribution, by ecosystem connectivity, by market size, by compounding advantages that began accumulating thousands of years before any individual actor made any individual decision. And here's the thing. This is what separates great founders, great leaders, great investors from everyone else. Those type of people think at a level of terrain, not tactics. When Steve Jobs decided to build the iPhone, he wasn't making a phone decision. He was making a terrain decision. He looked at the intersection of mobile computing, broadband internet, touchscreen technology, and realized that the continent had shifted. The landscape had changed. And whoever planted the crops on this new terrain first would dominate for a generation. That's a geographic thinking. That's Jared Diamond thinking. When Jensen Huang kept investing in the GPU computing for decades, long before AI became the hottest sector on earth, everyone thought he was insane. GPUs for gaming, that's a niche, that's a small island. But Jensen saw something nobody else saw. He saw the parallel computing was a continent, not an island. He saw the same chips that rendered video games could train neural networks, simulate physics, mine cryptocurrency, and power autonomous vehicles. He was planting crops along an east-west axis that nobody else recognized. And when the AI revolution arrived, NVIDIA was just well positioned. NVIDIA was the position. The entire industry was built on Jensen's terrain. Same pattern, same principle, different century. And I also wrote something in my notebook that's very, very important. Read the terrain before you choose the battle. I'm going to say that again because it's very powerful. Read the terrain before you choose the battle. Because the overwhelmingly majority of the founder failure isn't failure of execution. It's the failure of terrain selection. Brilliant people building brilliantly in the wrong environment. You can be the smartest person on your continent, but if your continent has no domesticable plants, no large animals, and a north-south axis that blocks the diffusion of your innovations, you're going to lose the mediocre operator on a continent with all four of Diamond's factors in their favor. And this is why market selection is the highest leverage decision a founder makes. Not product design, not team hiring, not fundraising strategy, market selection. Because the market is the continent, and the continent determines the ceiling. And yet, this is critical. Jared explicitly rejects fatalism. Environment matters enormously, but within any given environment, human agency, human inventiveness, and human effort still determine who wins and who loses. All human societies contain inventive people. Diamond writes, some environments just provide more starting materials and more favorable conditions for utilizing those inventions. That's the nuance, that's the balance. You cannot ignore the environment, but you are not a prisoner of it either. You can choose the environment to operate in. You can choose your market. You can choose your axis of distribution. You can choose your ecosystem. You can choose the continent on which you plant your flag. And once you've made the choice, you better understand the structural forces at play. Because those forces will determine more about your outcome than your product roadmap, your growth hacks, or your Series B ever will. And once you've chosen the right continent, then you pour everything you have into exploiting that structural advantage. Then you become maniacally focused on execution within your chosen terrain. Then you compound. Because here's what Jared proves beyond any reasonable doubt. Advantages compound. They compound across years. They compound across decades. They compound across centuries. They compound across millennia. A small head start in food production in 8500 BC became unsurmountable civilizational advantage by 1500 AD. That's 10,000 years of compounding, and the gap only widened over time. The same thing happens in business, just on a shorter time scales. Amazon's early investment in logistics infrastructures compounded for 25 years into a distribution moat that no competitor can replicate. Google's early investment in a search quality compounded into an advertising monopoly. Apple's early investment in the integrated hardware software ecosystem compounded into the most valuable company on earth. Small advantages, correctly positioned, relentlessly compounded. That's the formula. That's what Jerry discovered in the archaeological record. And it's what every founder discovers in their own operating experience. The striking difference between the long-term histories of people of the different continents have been due not to innovate differences in the peoples themselves, but two differences in their environments. There it is. One more time, the mantra of the entire book, the sentence that you should be tattooed on your wall, it should be everywhere on your table, your phone. Remember, you are not building in a vacuum. You are building on a continent with a specific axis, a specific set of domesticable resources, a specific epidemiological landscape, and a specific competitive density. Understand your continent, understand your axis, understand your starting materials, and then compound like hell. And one last thought before I let you go. I keep thinking about Yali, the New Guinean politician who asked Diamond the question on the beach in 1972. Why is it that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to the New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own? Jared says that Yali was one of the most charismatic, intelligent, curious people he'd ever met. Yali asked better questions than most PhDs. Jared knew. Yali's people, the New Guineans, have been navigating one of the most difficult environments on Earth for 40,000 years. Diamond argues that they are, on average, probably more intelligent than Westerners, not less, because their environment selected ruthlessly for intelligence, problem solving, and adaptability in ways that dense agriculture societies didn't. And yet Yali didn't have cargo, not because he was inferior, not because his people were less capable, but because he was standing on the wrong continent, a continent with 1/70th of Eurasia's area, a continent where all the large mammals had gone extinct, a continent separated from the global flow of innovation by thousands of miles of ocean. The smartest person in the room can still lose if the room is the wrong room. And that is the deepest lesson of this book. For anthropologists, for historians, for founders, for investors, for leaders. The talent is everywhere. The capability is everywhere. The hunger and intelligence and the will to build, that's universal. What's not universal is the terrain. What's not universal is the starting materials. What's not universal is the axis of distribution. This book isn't about ancient history. It's a manual for competitive strategy disguised in an anthropology text. And I'm telling you, if you run a company, if you're an investor, if you invest in companies, if you're an executive, if you're a leader, if you own Holdco, if you're trying to understand why some organizations dominate and others get eaten alive, this is essential reading. Maybe the most essential reading I've ever recommended on this show. Jared spent his career studying birds. He ended up writing the most important book about business strategy I've ever read. And this is why Charlie Munger highly recommends this book. This is one of his favorite books. Jerry didn't even know what he was doing. He wasn't even thinking about creating a business book. Remember, environment is the strategy, geography is the destiny, position determines the outcome, and more importantly, the game is won before the game begins. If you enjoyed this podcast, click like, subscribe, and do me a favor, share this on X, and see you next time. Peace.